I think it's fair enough for Michael Portillo to point out that 3.3 million households, 1 in 6, have no one over the age of 16 in employment. That is a problem that we need to discuss. And he's right, I think, to say that dependency on the state is not a good relationship for people to be in. But when he speaks of people in poverty as being idle, existing in subsidised slobbery, as being undeserving and ignorant, I think that's not helpful to having an open and frank debate about the kind of welfare state we want to have, which is the debate I want to have today. Finally, one kind of rider in terms of the discussion, I think it's important to make a very clear theoretical distinction, if you like, between reforming the welfare state on the one hand because we want to, right? Because we think that, for example, it might be too intrusive or doing the wrong kinds of things or wasting money. Reform because it needs it. And on the other hand, reform driven by the need to save money. I think if we need to save money in terms of the welfare state, we should talk honestly about that and cut things sensitively where we need to. But we shouldn't make arguments on the back of funding, lazy arguments, if you like, to push through a political agenda around the welfare state just because we say, well, we can't afford it, and therefore let's cut something and good things will happen. Those are slobby arguments. Anyway, that's enough from me. Can we all give our panellists a quick welcome, round of applause?
Angus, thanks very much. The title is Welfare Dependency, but really what we're talking about is dependency on government welfare. Is there a problem with receipt of benefits through the government social security system? And I would argue that there is a difference between receiving welfare, support if you're in poor health, or support if you're in times of hardship, unemployment, and so on. I think there is a difference between getting help from the government and getting help from a sort of different kind of policy, an insurance policy or a savings policy that you might have taken out yourself. And I would sort of raise two things about that. The first is, what's the advantage of doing it yourself, and if you like, in a private way? Well, the first I would say is the economic benefit, because if one is saving for oneself, saving for yourself, making insurance payments in the private sector, that doesn't take money out of the economy, and it generates funds for investment into industry. If one is paying through tax for benefits, then that does take money out of the economy. There's a deadweight loss in terms of economic activity, and it's also, at the moment in our current British government, relatively inefficiently used. And I just would, I would just love to know if anybody here can describe what they think their deal is with the government in terms of the amount that they pay in tax for the various healthcare benefits and social security benefits that you may claim today or may claim at some point in the future. Can you describe that? Can you even begin to describe it? And I don't think you can. I certainly can't. I mean, we may have been able to do it in 1948 when the Beveridge welfare state was created, and there was quite a clear deal between the amount of percentage you would pay in salary to government and the amount that you would get out in terms of a pension and then one or two other benefits. But over the intervening 61 years, the sort of welfare state has changed. I mean, it doesn't just change every year; it changes every month. Governments of all types fiddle away with the system, and I just think it is. It is impossible to know really what we pay and what we get, whereas separate private systems for health insurance or for unemployment insurance or whatever, there would be clarity. So I think that is another advantage. So once that general point is made, I mean, what then can be done about the current benefits that we get? And just very quickly, it seems to me that some of them can just be abolished, and we at my organisation have written a lot lately about middle class welfare, not just childcare, but all of the benefits claimed by people on middle and higher incomes. And in a report 2 weeks ago, we found something that we didn't expect or know, which was that if you take all the benefits claimed by people in Britain, £1 in 4 paid out in benefits goes to people on middle or high incomes. So this is in child benefit, retirement pension, statutory maternity pay, tax credits, the winter fuel allowance. I could go on, but there's an enormous, what seemed to us to be a surprisingly large amount of benefits going to people who don't need them. And Angus said, you can't we shouldn't have this discussion in the context of the fact that the government's run out of money. Well, I don't see how you can have this discussion without having that in mind. There has to be cuts in public spending. And so this would, those benefits, those many billions of pounds, would seem to me to be an obvious candidate for abolition. Other benefits can be devolved. At the moment, government administers things like unemployment benefits and does it in a very bureaucratic way, and in a way I think that is actually very unfair to people, to unemployed people. Those can be devolved either by making benefits offices independent, which is what someone like Frank Field, the Labour MP, would argue, or by handing them over to social enterprises or profit-making companies. And then the last idea is that some benefits can be privatised. We can all say, not everyone in society, but nearly everyone in society over their lives can save for a pension. We don't need to do that through government. Other countries have had great success in privatising disability insurance because actually employers are very good at getting people back to work in the way that our government-run welfare state hasn't been. So just to summarise, I think there is a difference about government-provided benefits. I think they are not as good as privately provided welfare, and middle-class work benefits can be abolished. Particularly unemployment benefits can be devolved, handed down to benefits offices and other organisations to run, and some benefits, particularly pensions, can be privatised.
Okay, thank you.
I've got 3 points to make under 2 headings. The first heading is just to get a bit clear what we mean by welfare dependency. What is it? What does that concept mean? And what's its resonance for us? What's its moral force? And the second point, the second area is I just want to make 3 general points about our attitude to welfare, but particularly to situate our attitude to welfare in the context with our attitude to work. And as we're encouraged to be provocative, I think we could equally identify work dependency as problematic for our culture, and our concerns about welfare dependency are to some degree parasitic on that dependency. I was just reflecting on, what welfare dependency means. First sense of that is simply anyone who's dependent on benefits for an income. In other words, anyone who receives benefits in a way that they require to meet their basic living needs is dependent on benefits in that descriptive sense. For those of you who don't know, for people above 25 on both job seekers allowance and the new employment and support allowance, it's £64.30 a week. That's to cover everything except housing, and some people have to supplement their housing out of that. And for people under 25, it's just under £51. So that's the first. Second, I think, is dependency as a failure of virtue or a moral failure on the part of the individual. And I think that the idea of dependency is it's a bit like someone in adulthood who remains dependent on their parents, or someone who's institutionalised, for example, in long-term care home or a prison. In other words, we're saying that people who are welfare dependent are failing to embody one of the core virtues of kind of liberal societies. It's a failure of independence, and hence, in a way, a failure of both maturity, rationality and autonomy, core liberal values. And that locates the flaws that we associate with dependency within the individual. And I think that informs a lot of the language around welfare scroungers, benefit cheats and so on. Third sense, I think, is dependency as a failure of society, a failure of the community. The idea that we've written off significant numbers of individuals, families and communities to a life of marginalisation and poverty in a culture in which exclusion from work is profound in terms of the level of cultural and economic dislocation it brings with it. Not just deprivation of income, but things like esteem, status, belonging, participation in the sort of community that reinforces moral requirements and so on. And looking at that, I think we can look to a really progressive agenda on welfare, which encompasses things like the skills agenda, some very progressive work on improving the access to employment for people with disabilities, including mental health problems. If you think of benefit cheating, for example, isn't that just a rational adaptation to a system that squeezed out the space and potential to combine a level of benefit dependence with a level of economic activity that falls short of full and permanent participation.
I think the welfare state and the dependent status that comes with it has long been regarded by its critics as the cause of everything that is going wrong with society. It's blamed for the breakdown of community and for the various deprivations and depravities associated with the creation of a dependent underclass, for antisocial behaviour to child abuse. It's also blamed for the failing UK economy, for unsustainable public spending, hidden unemployment and negative growth. And yes, for all that the welfare state finds itself wrongly accused of crimes against humanity, in my view, there is indeed a problem of welfare dependency. While there are only 800,000 official job seekers, more than 2.5 million people are claiming incapacity benefit. Hundreds of thousands more are reliant on housing benefit and income support, amongst other things. Interestingly, Andrew was talking about the expenditure on benefits, but if you actually look at the figures, the expenditure isn't that great compared to other items of expenditure. I think something like £58 billion is spent on pensions, whereas something like £2 billion is spent on job seekers' allowance. So it isn't a huge item of spending. It doesn't mean it's a good thing and something we shouldn't talk about, but I think we need to get that in proportion. In all, though, there are nearly 5 million people out of work and claiming benefits at the moment. And yet, for all the concern about public spending levels, particularly on welfare, critics do not oppose the retention of a safety net. The question is rather how big the net should be and how far it should be cast. I think it's pretty clear that the state should be stepping in right now to address the immediate needs of those most affected by the recession. According to a report by the Mental Health Foundation, the economic downturn is having an adverse effect on the nation's well-being. That's not surprising, perhaps. But this shift from providing for people's welfare to attending to their well-being brings problems of its own. The use of the term well-being today tends to imply a more intimate and extensive role for the state. And it's appointed experts in managing people's lives for them. It also assumes that people in general lack the resources to cope with life. On all sides of the debate, there is a failure to grasp, I think, just how profound this shift has already been, and how ingrained in the wider culture the problem of dependency has become as a consequence. Beyond the confines of the welfare state, the micropolitics of lifestyle and therapy, ostensibly aimed at promoting our well-being, are in fact making us all dependent on the intervention of third parties. And again, I take issue with Andrew on this. I think dependency on government welfare is just one form of dependency. Dependency is essentially the same problem wherever the final bill happens to land. And I think by talking about it in those terms, the tendency to transfer the problem of dependency from one sector to another without actually tackling the underlying problem. The Audit Commission has warned that local authorities need to be prepared for another surge in social problems such as addiction, alcoholism and domestic violence that we can expect as a consequence of what they call the second wave of the recession. I think this concern with people's potentially troubling behaviour, about the risks they face and about their emotional and relationship needs are unsurprisingly having their impact on welfare policy. All parties claim to support radical welfare reform and bang on about imposing tougher conditions on the workless. The Tories say they want to protect us from stifling big government and to end state control over the lives of individuals. And yet, the lot of benefit claimants also tends to be understood in terms of people's needs and personal inadequacies, because they lack self-esteem or self-confidence, not because, as critics would have put it in the past, because they're lazy or bone idle or work shy. There's nobody telling the jobless to get on their bikes anymore, as Norman, now Lord Tebbit, once did. Self-styled Red Tory Philip Blond says he doesn't object to lone parents because they're lone parents, but because their children do so badly at school, or get addicted to drugs and alcohol, or go on to commit crimes when they get older. Similarly, James Bartholomew, a right-wing journalist, former banker and critic of the welfare state, claims that it is the damage done to children rather than the fact that they're born out of wedlock that he finds so objectionable. I think this only goes to show that for all that the welfare state is blamed for the decline of civilization as we know it, it feeds off the consensus view that people aren't able to run their own lives anymore, and that's across the political spectrum. Yeah. If anything, the critics of the welfare state underestimate the problem of dependency by failing to recognise this, and the pervasiveness of this low view of what people are like. Dependency is not about the feckless few. It runs much deeper than that. If we are to defend welfare, we need to work out how it can be a help and not a hindrance, and a boost rather than a burden. Whatever the merits of the welfare state, the post-war optimism that it inspired is long gone. I think it's only when we challenge the pessimism of our own age and the notion that people are essentially vulnerable, helpless, needy, and not to be trusted, rather than robust, resourceful, able, and autonomous, that will regain our independence.
What I'd like to do in this talk today is to talk to you about back to basics. What are the reasons that we actually have the benefit system? What are the benefits of benefits? Because I think with all the criticism that's been about at the moment, we actually forget those very basic points. The first is it's about sharing risk. The state is effectively acting as one giant insurance company acting for the people, by the people. That means that if you happen to lose in the lottery of life, if you happen to be born with a condition that means you can't work, if you lose your job through a redundancy, or if there happen to be no jobs out there, you have a safety net. Now, Andrew was saying that it may be better to be providing that through a private system rather than the state system, but there are a few reasons why it might be better to do it through the state. Just off the top of my head, larger number involved means that you're spreading risk further. It also means that we have accountability over the system by being able to vote a government in and out, which means we get to determine how that system works. But the most important reason, I think, actually is the second reason why I think benefits are important, and that is that there are externalities that the market doesn't cater for of letting people sink too low. If you let someone go without work and without benefits, you get other costs emerging in other areas. If a mother isn't working and she's not on benefits, she cannot pay for her child to have broadband access, to buy books for the school. At some point, that child's education suffers and society loses out as a result. Benefits also mean that people are not slipping into debt, destitution, or homelessness, which is incredibly expensive to get people out of, and it prevents people turning to crime. The third reason that I'd like to suggest benefits are a good idea is that they tackle inequalities that go further than money. A lot of the reasons we give benefits are nothing to do with people being poor. Now, child benefit or carers allowance, for example, is actually tackling gender inequality. That's saying that at the moment, mostly women are providing these services and they're not getting a wage for it, despite their work being socially valuable. What the state does is by providing benefits, it rewards socially valuable work and gives women autonomy and economic rewards for work that is valuable. The final reason why I think that we should keep benefits universal and keep them for everybody is that it builds a sense of national community and collective responsibility. If everybody pays in and takes out, the service is an entitlement as British citizens rather than a handout for losers. Yeah? There is a dignity in this and an acknowledgement that we are all part of something bigger. I'd just like to finish by saying that this idea about a sense of national community and collective responsibility that the benefit system brings is something that David Cameron just can't handle. He was asked on a Radio 4 programme the other day whether he believed in two notions of the state. The first was where the state simply provides a level playing field for individuals and society to get along. It provides law and order, and it provides defence. The second conception of the state was one in which people are part of a bigger national project. The state provides a sense of collective identity and a sense of a purpose or mission, which kind of chimes with his one nation Toryism. And do you know what? He just couldn't answer it. He couldn't get it. And I would say that having universal welfare benefits alongside the NHS are one of the key things that hold us together as a society and will make us a better nation. Thank you.
One of the interesting things about this debate for me is how we've gone from a position of social services provision to away from social services to what's more about the micromanagement of individual behaviour. Like social services has now become social work. And I think that's come about because of a couple of things. I think one was the sort of political elites that started in the previous Conservative administration but gained pace with New Labour, is a lack of faith in its own ability to solve these wider socio-economic problems. And so what we've seen an outsourcing of services within it. So you got community groups to provide the social care, to provide the services. But linked to that was a real lack of trust in communities. So for example, community groups that were supposed to respond to local need ended up doing government policy because they were no longer given grants to get their funding. It depended on how many government initiatives they could pick
Yeah.
So the link to that, I think it's been touched on, is this the way that the whole issue goes from being a structural issue around jobs to one about the individual subjectivity of the poor. So the solution is not that they need more jobs, but they need counselling. The problem with communities, I had one of my students said to me the other day there was a bit of a riot on the estate that they live on, and the policeman came out, and the policeman actually said, the trouble with this estate is it suffers from low self-esteem. So we've now got this sort of, we're looking at things through a mental health lens. And I think that then leads to these therapeutic sort of solutions where you get sort of counselling, take on the sick role, the rise of work stress. And I actually think these therapeutic solutions are actually more problematic. So this new dependency is more problematic than the old. And I can also think of Norman Tebbit, well, he was too hard to say it, but his contemporary equivalents, it wouldn't be, it's not get on the bike anymore, it's get on the couch.
One of the crucial, genuinely interesting policy discussions which might actually impact on people's lives some way down the road is the debate about how we design a benefit system that's better at allowing flexibility between welfare dependency and full-time unemployment. For example, at the moment it's very hard to take a job for a few weeks if that's what's on offer. It's hard to volunteer. If you earn over a very small amount of money, it all has to go back to the state, and there's a real crunchy policy discussion to be had there.
I think it's interesting that the incapacity benefit has become almost iconic. It's the benefit that everybody wants to complain about. Obviously, it's partly because of the huge rise in numbers in recent times, but I think it also kind of stands for a new sick role that everybody seems to be adopting. And also, perhaps it kind of hints at a kind of culture of early retirement. Like, I think it's widely regarded that incapacity benefit is often used, particularly by those working in old mining communities, for instance, and it becomes a slightly more generous option. It is very slightly more generous, and there are less conditions attached than there are to job seekers' allowance. So perhaps people need jobs, but they also, some people need more support than before. Those who have been out of work for 5 years plus, which is what half of those claiming incapacity benefit are doing, inevitably their ability to find a job is going to be that bit more difficult because they're out of the loop. Yes, we need more jobs. Yes, some people are going to be incapacitated. So I think there's two problems. We have what I'd call a degenerate political culture that encourages a certain passivity, but we also have a failing economy. Well, that's perhaps more obvious. And the combination of the two is what produces dependency.
I think there's also a real distinction to be made here between doing state intervention well and doing it badly. You know, what you were talking about over here about having huge government targets and about how having local groups having to respond to those rather than to community needs. I'm for state intervention. I'm completely against that. You know, I'd really like to see a lot more autonomy and trust given to teachers, given to community groups. When I say I'm for state intervention and for benefits, I'm not for psychological or behavioural changes. I find that they just distract from the real issues. I mean, if you tell a kid that comes into school, oh, you know, you should go to counselling because you're having behavioural problems, and actually what he just needs is his mum to be able to spend a bit more time at home with him and help on his homework rather than having to work 3 jobs, or for his dad to get off alcohol and to have a little bit more support in doing that. I think those kind of issues are far more important, and giving the kids psychological counselling is often just distracting from the real issues at work.
I've worked in the benefit system, particularly housing benefit, for a long time, and it's actually, for people to claim benefits, it's a very demeaning and intrusive you know, thing that they have to do. It's really not a very nice thing at all, and I think it has an impact in terms of undermining one's sense of as an individual with aspirational purpose or any sort of dignity, rather than this debate about, you know, cutting and or not cutting benefit. We should be looking. The benefits have come in because there's a lack of services. I think really, you know, it's the non-provision of services like universal childcare, you know, jobs or cheap and universal housing, which forces people onto benefits, and the government is ducking that responsibility of providing services.
Isn't one aspect of welfare that really is a subsidy to, well, the main aspect, in fact, that it's a subsidy to the employers? And isn't that, in a way, that kind of sounds a bit old-fashioned now, but in some ways, shouldn't we just have better wages?
Several people have said that you need just to make public services better, so make schools better, make hospitals better, then people don't need to rely on the cash money. And, that absolutely, it's a bigger discussion, but that is absolutely right. Several people have talked about flexibility, why it's incredibly hard, as people have said, to have a short-term job, come off benefit, come out of that job, go back on benefit, as Marcus was saying, volunteer. It's too hard, and there should be much greater flexibility. And to me, that is about devolving the responsibility of running these things to benefit offices and other companies. So why not have benefit offices pay for travel cards for job seekers? Because if people do get back into work, there's a savings there in the amount of benefits that are paid out. So we need new ideas about that. And then there's several points on the economy. Really, shouldn't we have higher wages, more jobs, less unemployment? Well, I don't think the UK can do that on its own. But the good news is that once we get out of this recession, China and India and Brazil and Russia and the developing world are going to grow unbelievably. There is going to be a much bigger economy. There's going to be much more demand for what we do in this country, unless we do some crazy things. London is going to be particularly attractive. And a lot of the things that we're talking about here, a lot of the general economic situation will improve.
I think that I would make a plea that we should start in a sort of blank paper way, moving away from the terms of the debate as they've been for a long time, and completely rethink our attitudes to work and exclusion from work at a fundamental level. Partly with the reflection that perhaps the model of everyone working full-time indefinitely is not a fantastic model for a good society that makes the best use of our productive capacity to deliver the sorts of lives people benefit from living. And the second related point is, I think at a very practical level, for me, that really focuses on rethinking the balance between work and non-work in individuals' lives over their lifetime. And that is a lot about that zone between benefit dependency and full-time permanent stuff.
I think we need to defend generous provisions so that people can actually get by when they're going through a difficult time through unemployment, disability, whatever it might be. And I think we should absolutely defend that. I think the important point is that the welfare state and the state more broadly tends to mirror our view of ourselves. If we regard ourselves as vulnerable and in need of support, then the state will step in and do that. And it will encourage us to think like that. I think perhaps this is where the therapy point comes in. I'm not opposed to therapy as such. Therapy has an important role to play in a minority of people's lives. The problem is that our culture has become consumed by a culture of therapy, a culture of dependency, in which that's become the norm rather than the exception. I think that's the problem. And finally, in relation to enterprise, I think I absolutely would support people being as self-reliant as they possibly can and trying to find their own solutions where they possibly can. I think the state should only step in the last instance. The problem is that it gets more involved in our lives more of the time, and that's a problem, because it tends to undermine people's ability to run their own lives and come up with their own solutions. And I think we should be actually doing the opposite and allowing people to actually get on with life.
I think the point that you made was an incredibly insightful one, and that what we've got now is a welfare state that doesn't just help people for a few months or even a few years while they get back into work, but actually people who are workless for their entire lives. And that's because the nature of our economy and our society is changing. We don't have rewards for certain types of work that we used to. Instead, our economy rewards people who work in the financial system. But the question is, do you pull the plug on those communities that have worklessness and are living on estates and haven't got opportunities? Or do you find better ways of helping them, better ways of intervening? And also, do you start changing our work practices so that people can work with 0-hour contracts, or people can feel still that they can survive in those kind of conditions?
Thank you very much, and can we all thank our panel?